Welcome back to the Cover 3 podcast here on CBS Sports. That's Tom Connelly. That's Bud Elliott. That is ESPN's Bill Connelly back once again. Hanging out right here, youtube.com/cover3 and all across the 24/7 Sports Facebook network. You can smash it. You can tickle it, but just press that subscribe and press that like and come and join us in the chat. We will take questions for Bill or for any of us as we continue to work our way throughout this conversation. Bill comes and joins us every year and sometimes multiple times throughout a year to be able to get sort of that wide view of the college football landscape. A lot of fun, and we are glad to have him back. He has a multitude of pieces and content available at ESPN.com right now. You also have probably heard him on ESPN's Family of Network, the podcasts, some television too. Hey. And of course, we are going to get into that. SP Plus is out. Returning Production is out. And all of that information has allowed for him to be able to spin some ceiling and floor conversation that I thought was very interesting. We're going to keep rocking with that. But first, some headlines, some news from Thursday night. Our great Notre Dame crisis has been solved. So Gerad Parker, the tight ends coach for the 2022 season, is reportedly going to be promoted to offensive coordinator. This comes after Notre Dame talked to Kansas State's Colin Klein, talked to Utah's Andy Ludwig. And now we've also got a move where we've got a quarterbacks coach, sort of like rounding the staff into form. Now that it seems that we're settled, actually, Bill, I'll throw it to you first. As all of these steps have been unfolding for Notre Dame, what's been your general read on sort of like the way that the Fighting Irish are handling business in replacing Tommy Rees?
Well, I do think it's really interesting that this is kind of a semi-disastrous process, but nobody really seems to be blaming Marcus Freeman for it.
Right.
I mean, it's been pretty clear when you make a public appearance at a Notre Dame sporting event with your prospective offensive coordinator, and then suddenly your school isn't willing to pay the buyout, that wasn't your fault. They should have never gotten to that stage if buyout was going to be an issue or whatever else was going on there. It's still pretty underwhelming to end up where we ended up here, though. Parker, offensive coordinator, 2 years at West Virginia. I'm looking at my SP Plus rankings. They were 89th and 95th in offensive SP Plus his 2 years. Two ways to look at that. Number one, maybe he wasn't very good, but number two, his quarterbacks were bad. And maybe if he had the quarterback, everything would have been different. And now he's going to have the quarterback. So we'll find out at least what he thinks he can do with an offense and everything else. And it's still pretty underwhelming to get here, though.
I think Bill said it today. We said it yesterday. We asked the question: Is Notre Dame just being cheap? And it does make you wonder: is there more to this story? If I can spend this in a way to say something I have not said on this show yet about this topic over the last 2 or 3 episodes.
Well, there's been some damage control here. I thought that was interesting because Heather Dinich, in the report that popped on Thursday night, said that it's like Notre Dame sources indicate that it wasn't just the buyout and they could have made things work. But by the time that we had gotten the financial commitment, Andy Ludwig was already on a plane back to Salt Lake City. And I don't know. My favorite take is
you can't fly private again. Get back from.
Yeah, I like the idea that they just hired him to copy Andy Ludwig's offense.
I mean,
come get all of his ideas, send
right.
them back, and then be able to install the same offense on the cheap with somebody else.
Can we spend this in a positive way for Utah about what it says about Andy Ludwig's opinion of Cam Rising's timeline to be back and healthy? I mean, like if you're going to jump, if you're Andy Ludwig for a job, and I think Notre Dame is a step up from Utah, you could jump after the year you just had, second consecutive Rose Bowl, or if you want to run it back one more time with Rising and Keithy's coming back, right? And you got a decent number of players in that team, and they might be a little more explosive this year. Who knows? But if you didn't feel good about Rising, I think you probably try to find a way to just be really patient and make that work.
I don't have Utah. I don't have Utah fans among my friends or my family. I do have a lot of Notre Dame fans among friends and family. And I feel bad for Gerad Parker because he did just get to be the offensive coordinator at Notre Dame, which is a pretty good spot to be as a football coach. but Notre Dame fans are pissed.
Yeah.
He's in a very tough spot because it's those things like it's like a transfer recruiting situation with fans where they'd never heard of the guy before, but then as soon as he becomes the person that's supposed to be everybody thinks he's great. He's the guy we have to have, and then we don't get him, and everybody sucks. I hope this person needs to be fired. And there's kind of that thing going on with Ludwig, but not so much Ludwig, just in general, the process that led them to getting here, which we've gone over. Like, it was supposed to be this guy, and apparently the only reason it isn't this guy is because suddenly Notre Dame got cheap and didn't want to pay the buyout for him and the offensive line coach. And that is the way the fan base is taking to it. That is what they're, I'm hearing the last couple.
Yeah, it doesn't. If you win, if Parker turns out great, then none of it matters. It was just offseason fodder.
Mm-hmm.
Pete Carroll, 7th choice at USC, all that stuff. But it was. Yeah, it was underwhelming. And you can say Ludwig, if he was really just dying to get out because he didn't like what he was coming back, he knew his reputation would go down after this year and he wanted to kind of wait it out. Maybe that is a good sign for Utah that he felt comfortable going back that quickly. But it seemed like this was a lot more on Notre Dame than anything else. And we'll see.
Yeah, and this isn't that dissimilar, honestly, than the start of the Brian Kelly era.
Yep.
Brian Kelly wasn't able to do whatever he wanted when he first became the head coach of Notre Dame either. And a lot of that was due to maybe some scared feelings about the previous head coaches that they'd had there. So they were kind of, they weren't just buying in fully. But Marcus Freeman's going through something Brian Kelly went through earlier. I'm surprised that he is. I feel like you would have been maybe give him a little more leeway, but we'll see. Maybe, once he starts winning games, he'll have more decision-making power and won't be overridden by those above him.
Tom, can we get a Italian pronunciation check on our new quarterbacks coach?
Gino Guidugli.
Nice. I have not spoken to Gino Guidugli.
I'm sorry, Gino Guidugli. Yeah.
But he was at Cincinnati for 5 years. For most of the Luke Fickell tenure, ends up spending the last 2 years with the Bearcats as the play caller. Was such a valuable coach to Fickell that he decides to bring him to Wisconsin. That to me is what I'm hearing from Notre Dame fans as like the piece that you can be like, well, we got a good quarterbacks coach to go with it, because if your offensive coordinator is, coming from being a tight ends coach, then you got to have something to at least give the idea that you're going to be able to get some good quarterback developments, particularly when the quarterback is so important. Is that just trying to tuck yourself in and feel better about this, or do we think that Guidugli is going to be a good addition to the staff?
I think he could be a good addition to the staff. Also, from Guidugli's standpoint, Notre Dame is a better job than Wisconsin, but not by like leaps and bounds. But I think it's, at least in my head, a step up. But also with CJ Carr coming in, Lloyd Carr's grandson, who is thought of as a pretty good prospect. And so if you're a quarterback coach, that's a guy that if you maintain the relationship or establish a relationship and keep him in the fold, that's a guy you could sort of hitch your wagon to and elevate yourself as a coach. It's no different than like, a pitching coach wanting to go, coach a really team of really good arms. Like the talent that you have connections to, it does seem to matter. So it's probably fine. Like I do think, Desmond, I thought Ritter got better during his college career. I was really not I was not a Desmond Ritter fan at all as a sophomore. And people are like, this kid's got some juice. Like, I don't see it yet. And I was wrong on that. Maybe I was right as a sophomore, but I was late to pick up just how much he was improving. And maybe Guidugli gets some credit for that.
Yeah.
And if you are Guidugli, this is being under Phil Longo, right, is a little bit more of like a vertical roadblock, I would say, in terms of like final say, how much you really going to be able to have your hands on this. I kind of think that this is a little bit of a step up in terms of the authority and your voice in the room. But I say that not as a coach. All right, Bill, all the assistant coaching moves were almost basically, putting all the pieces together now that Notre Dame has settled. Is there one assistant coaching hire or move or a couple that have really stood out to you from this recent spin of the carousel?
Well, Longo is the most noteworthy one just because of how weird it felt and how much of an acknowledgement it seems to be Like I was reminded of Bob Stoops, the stories he would tell about when he first got to Oklahoma in '99, and the historical version of him hiring Mike Leach had to do with, I hated defending that offense. It was so hard, and therefore I wanted everybody else to have to experience that. And the one time I've ever talked to Bob Stoops, he was like, "Yeah, that's kind of true, but really I just needed quarterbacks. I needed a system that would allow me to sign quarterbacks." And within like a month, he signed Josh Heupel, Nate Hibble from Georgia, and Jason White, in 1 month he signed like his next, however long Jason White was there, his next 17 years worth of quarterbacks, all in just at once. And so it worked, and it reminded me a lot of this. I mean, it was almost like Fickle saying, "I know what our tradition is here. I know that I can recruit big linemen and all that other stuff, and I still want to run the ball, but also I want to make sure I can sign blue chip quarterbacks. So let's go find a coordinator that'll allow me to do that." And it worked. They roped in like 3 transfers immediately. So that, I think it's really interesting right now that Georgia Southern, last year's Georgia Southern team might end up being one of the more impactful teams of the portal era, just because it demonstrated how clearly you can shift identity like that. He signed whatever it was, 3 quarterbacks and 4 receivers. Fickle did right out of the gate here after signing Longo. Maybe that's a sign that you can make massive changes very, very quickly. And we'll see if it works. Maybe it's square peg, round hole still, even in the portal area. But I'm really curious about that.
Especially when you go to your AD and say, "I want to hire Longo," and he doesn't overrule it.
Yeah.
Tanner Mordecai, one of the is he the alpha in that room?
He's the most experienced anyway. Yeah. So I would have to assume so.
Speaking of transfers, and we'll take questions throughout if you want to drop them in the chat. This one comes from Eddie, and it's for Bill. Eddie says, we're about to get into SP Plus. How are transfer portal players, such as Tanner Mordecai, how are their production factored in to SP Plus?
It's a lot harder than it used to be. Still trying to figure out the best process for transfers in general. But after getting a year's worth of data last year, I kind of have at least a slightly better idea. Basically, the way it used to be, when if you signed 5 transfers, it was a lot. I could pretty much account for it pretty well by just basically plugging your production at your old school into the production at your new school. So if a team lost its starting quarterback but brought in somebody else's starting quarterback, you'd end up with 50% returning production for yardage at the quarterback position or whatever. And it worked pretty well because it was pretty low volume. Then suddenly last year, you've got teams signing 18 transfers, among whom are the soon-to-be Heisman winner and the defending Biletnikoff winner. That was never how that worked. And I knew I didn't have a very good read on how to do that. But taking last year into account now, you still have that returning production piece where your production just gets plugged right into the numerator and denominator at your new school. And so it counts as returning production. But then it also, the recruiting part of SP Plus projections now is a lot more complicated than it used to be, where I could just kind of take averages from whatever services and plug it in and use that as this year's value. Transfer volume, transfer quality, and then the quality of the freshmen come in and all kind of play a role. And depending on the year involved, they play a different level of a role. So it's a little weird right now. And I can't say that based on the way I do it with transfer volume and transfer quality and all that, the number 1 recruiting class as far as SP Plus is concerned for 2023 was LSU's, because they mixed kind of top 10-ish class with a whole bunch of transfers, a whole bunch of pretty good transfers, experienced transfers. And so they'll get the most credit for recruiting this year. And then next year and the year after, when the transfers have been kind of filtered out, Alabama will get the most credit for this year because they had the best 4-year recruiting class, I guess you could say. So it's a little weird. And the sample size, I have 2 years now for basically doing this, and that's not really the sample size I like, but I guess with college football, we never get the sample size we like. So we'll see.
Yeah. I don't know if you listen to our Locks pods during the season, but if you've seen my record the last 2 years, you know that I am also struggling trying to figure out how to account for transfers and all that kind of stuff.
It's weird. It's very weird.
Bill, one follow-up to that. How do we avoid double counting the production that the transfers are bringing in with also the high rating? Because obviously, transfers who have been really highly rated or really highly productive will usually be highly rated. But yet we do have some transfers who, like take a Denver Harris who left A&M to go to LSU. Mm-hmm. I think there's some signal in that he actually played as a true freshman, but he didn't play a lot, right? And we had him as a 5-star out of high school.
Yeah,
like he's driving needs some improvement, but ultimately, like when he's on the field, he's pretty good. Like, how do we avoid the double count for like a Jordan Addison, right? Who won the Blitnikoff? We had him as a 5-star transfer. He also, like, you mash the yards in there. Like, how do you kind of parse those out?
I mean, right now I don't. That's the easy answer. I mean, I guess the way I'm looking at it right now is that with Jordan Addison, he was a sure thing transfer. He wasn't we think he's still going to be really good. It was, we know he's really good. And so, USC did get kind of double counted in terms of the transfer ratings and then also the production. But I mean, SP Plus still undersold USC's offense last year. So, I think right now I'm just rolling with it. And once there's more data and I can kind of fiddle with the weights and whatnot, we can figure out something better. But right now, what I did last year was okay, but it wasn't overselling those guys. It was underselling them, if anything.
So let's start with the returning production as we start to, unpack, because returning production is, of course, a piece of SP Plus. We're building up to the big daddy right here. We had this conversation with you here on the Cover 3 podcast before about the way that the extra COVID year has just wrecked trying to keep track of this stuff. And coaches have said the same thing. It's impossible. It's a scholarship crunch. And I remember you told us we've seen numbers we've never seen before. Mm-hmm. I guess, number one, do you think that is starting to calm down just a little bit? And then what are the parameters? Like when they go to ESPN.com and when they pull up the story, where are the lines that you would draw and say, like, if it's higher than this number, this is like really significant. If it's lower than this number, then like this is going to be a big question mark.
Yeah, I think we were really, from a returning production standpoint, because of the portal, we kind of went back to normal last year. Like I'm looking at, I've been collecting this data since 2014. The average, like the national average for returning production was 63% in 14, 62, 63, 64, 62, 61, 63. So all right in that range. And then in 2021, it was 77% on average. And then last year it was 63. And this year, so far, it's 62. So since I take transfers into account, and you can, if you lose guys, you can bring in more guys, all that other stuff. It seems to have balanced out from that perspective. We know there's more guys in the player pool still, and that hasn't changed. But for my purposes, it does seem to have returned to normal in that regard.
Bill, I had an interesting note that I pulled out from the returning production piece, and it's something I know that like you and I used to rap about a lot. And it said, broken out by position / player, you're looking at roughly 29% for the quarterback, 6% for the running back, each of the 4 receivers and or tight ends, about 9% for each offensive lineman.
Yep.
He said, with each year of data, offensive line snaps become a heavier piece of the equation, which I find interesting. I also found that interesting. I'm wondering, why, as the years go on, is that becoming a bigger part of the equation?
Well, I think it always has been. I just didn't have that data. I think that's the easiest answer. Because, when I first started doing this, I didn't have access to snap counts. Basically, all I could really glean from offensive line was how many games you started last year, how many you've started total. And then, were you all conference or whatever? And that's fine. I made do, but with kind of bad inputs there. Offensive line, returning production on the offensive line didn't really move the needle all that much in the overall equation, because it just wasn't good. It didn't tell the right story. But now that I have that piece of info, and now that I've had it for a few years, like every time I kind of, every offseason I go in and just look at the weights, like how could, you do that retrofitting exercise that is very statistically, the nerds will shame you for, but it's kind of where I always start off with, just to see how the things are changing as I get more data. And every single time I start fiddling with that stuff in like December after the season's over, it appears that I could have made better projections by weighting offensive line snap counts more. So therefore I do it moving forward. And it is, I mean, the narrative that I crafted when I didn't have any good offensive line stats was that the most important areas on offense were quarterback by far, obviously, but then that receiver piece, the continuity in the receiving core mattered a ton, still kind of does. But it appears that continuity on the offensive line is the second most important thing behind quarterback. And yeah, like I said, I think that was always the answer. I just didn't have the right data to prove it.
And what percentage of this year-over-year change is just called Virginia?
That's right. It's nice to have extreme examples. And we certainly had an extreme example last year, not only with how much Virginia lost, but how bad their offensive line was after they lost all those guys.
You break it down like on the site, you've got the overall returning production, then you've got it broken down by offense, defense, and how they rank. And have you noticed, is there a correlation between like the impact that the returning production has? Is it stronger if you have more on offense or more on defense? Like I look at the rankings right now, and Tom Herman is stepping into a very good spot in that FAU has the third most returning production in the country. But while it's first on the defensive side of the ball, it's 59th on the offensive side of the ball. So is there an area where you've seen results indicate that it's better to have more guys returning on defense or offense?
It seems like I have the weighting set up differently for the two. And I do think that defense is a little more like if you return 90% of your defense, it probably means a little bit more than if you return 90% of your offense. For whatever that reason is. I mean, I'm open to speculating, but that's a bigger in terms of how it's projected to change SP plus. The extremes on defense are counted are a little heavier overall. So I'm open to theories on that, but that's what it appears to be.
I don't have a theory, but that is fun because it's sort of counter to the idea that offense is a little more of a team game, while defense is more of like a collective individual effort. Right.
Yeah.
Like that is, I'm gonna be thinking about the rest of the day. That's fun.
I wonder if it's just experience and like instincts kind of coming into fact when you're playing in a defense and knowing what you're supposed to do. Whereas I think sometimes maybe on offense, talent just overwhelms it. You know what I mean?
Talent and or system, right?
Yeah.
Like an offensive coordinator, at least if he has the right quarterback, can probably figure things out if he's really good or has a really good system or whatever. I don't know. Like I'm open to brainstorms.
So there's a team, and this is where we have to take the numbers, and this is where we have to take what we know and what we expect. There's a team that not only is very, very low in the returning production, but also has turnover at both the offensive and defensive coordinator positions on the staff. The offense ranks number 120 out of 133. The defense ranks number 127 out of 133. As a team, the Alabama Crimson Tide are number 125. Now I'm asking you to step like out of the data and then just like as we're just sitting here talking ball, what concerns you, or like where are you looking at this Alabama team as we head into a season that no Bryce Young, turnover everywhere, production lost? It's an interesting season in Tuscaloosa.
The sky's falling. They're going to go 6-6.
Clip it, Jordan. Clip it.
No, I mean, I think it is certainly noteworthy that they were projected fourth in SP plus. I don't think they've ever been projected lower than second, maybe a third somewhere in there. So yeah, the sky is, but by their standards that they've set, this is certainly a falling apart situation. But no, I mean, it's a lot of change, and he's dealt with this change before. And there is certainly, for those national powers that recruit most of the 4- and 5-star kids, Alabama, Georgia, Ohio State, whoever else. There is kind of a different standard when it comes to returning production. You're not going to rank Georgia's never going to rank number 1 in returning production. They're just going to lose too many blue chippers, and they're going to lose backups to other schools. And then they're going to sign a bunch of new 5-stars and be just fine. So I do kind of, when you look at those teams, I do kind of look at them in a different way. Kent State's way down there. They're probably going to have a real tough year this year, and Alabama's going to have a real tough year by ranking 4th. So yeah, it is a difference, but I mean, that doesn't even take into account the coordinator changes. But it just acknowledges that they lost their starting quarterback, starting running back, number 3 and 4 receiving options, 3 offensive line starters, and most of the backups. Like I'm counting, there were 11 guys who had more than 30 snaps on the offensive line, and 4 of them come back. Defensively, it's a little better, but it's still top 2 defensive tackles, top 2 linebackers, and half the 2 deep of the secondary. That's just a lot. I mean, obviously they're replacing all these guys with 5 stars or high 4 stars or whatever, and it might be just fine. And maybe it's telling that he didn't really dip into the portal. He kind of needed Jahmyr Gibbs last year, and we kind of knew he needed a running back last year, and he went out and got one. He didn't really do much, especially on offense. So, maybe he thinks it's just fine. Maybe he's waiting till the spring portal explosion and get guys then. But it's a lot. It's a lot of change, and they'll probably be fine. But there's a slightly less sure chance of that than normal.
We don't want to clip Bill on this, but like if this happens, right? Like inevitably Bama will slide. They will not continue to be Death Star Bama, for the next 100 years. Most likely.
Argue they're not Death Star Bama right now. They're just one of the best teams in college football.
Yeah.
Right. So this is probably how it looks. Right. You didn't get Ryan Grubb from Washington. You had to settle for Tommy Rees. You didn't get to hire Jeremy Pruitt. Whether you believe those reports, I do. That's probably who you wanted to hire. You had to end up getting Kevin Steele, right? Like you lose Bryce Young, who NFL guys have some questions about the size, but in college, the guy's like really, really
absurdly
good and has always been a killer, like literally for the last 6 years that he's played football. And go back to his sophomore year in Cali, a total stud. If we're doing this in 2024, looking back, we're like, okay. We could have seen this as the start of the fall, not getting the coordinators that you really wanted, not being able to replace the quarterback, losing a bunch of important guys. Like maybe SP Plus is seeing something, putting them fourth, but yet they're like ceiling and floor, which I don't want to jump ahead of that article too fast, but maybe we should, if we're talking one team, mention it. I mean, what is Bama's ceiling and floor? It's got to be
good,
really good.
Yeah, like their floor, and I define, we'll talk about this later, I guess, but I kind of looked at ceilings and floors, realistic ceilings and floors, like what has at least a 10% chance of happening, basically. Not like Nebraska having a 0.02 chance of going 12-0, therefore their ceiling is 12-0.
Yes.
Nebraska's going undefeated.
As far as semi-realistic ceilings, we're looking at 11-1 to 8-4 for Alabama. So still mostly there.
8-4.
Tuscaloosa would burn to the ground.
That's break
glass.
And you look at their schedule and how they're projected. They're favored in every single game, but it's 69% win probability against Texas and 72 at Mississippi State and 68 at A&M and 63. Geez, they're all in the 60s. 63 Tennessee, 65 LSU. You don't win every single game. You only win 65% of the time when you're a 65% win probability. So that does open the door if they don't overachieve the ratings, that it does open the door for a few more tight upsets here. And, last year they still ended up second because of the upside they showed in their good games. And the fact that we freaked out and talked about how terrible they are this year when they lost to Tennessee and LSU in the last second on the road. Like they're still probably going to be really, really, really good. But I guess the offensive line is where I think is the biggest, like for that ceilings and floors piece, I did a little biggest variable for each team. I just went with the overarching kind of change theme for Alabama, but really offensive line was just mediocre this last year. And because of Bryce Young, you got away with it more than you would with a mortal quarterback. So that's the one area where things absolutely have to change, and they have to change with at minimum two new starters. So there is that.
Not to do 25 minutes on Alabama, but
I don't know. That's good for clicks.
It is good for clicks. I assume SP Plus sees Tyler Booker as one of the returning starters, if you will.
Yeah, I mean he had 400 snaps, so he counts for that.
I think we're going to be talking about him NFL draft, in 2024.
Yeah,
really legitimate guy,
like first round guy.
Yeah, I saw him at IMG. He just looked different. I think there's a couple of reasons why Javion Cohen transferred to Miami, and he might be one of them.
We'll keep and also allegedly, maybe something about a law school.
Well, our listeners put together the dots. They found the IG. They found her IG and the aspiring law student. Where am I going to
a listener said that actually should be an off-season segment where we just we throw out things that we have heard and that cannot confirm at all, and then just let the Cover 3 internet sleuths just like turn up because you at least gave them the crumb. You're like, it could be Javion Cohen who transferred to Miami. Then we found out that his girlfriend was an aspiring law student, and she went to Alabama as well. You're just kind of like, well.
That's when you've got an established podcast, by the way, is when you've got the audience that'll do work for you.
And look, we don't want anything to we don't want them to, we don't sick them on anybody, right? Because we don't want to have, I don't think that our listeners are like that, but we do want them to contribute to the conversation. Great research department, the Cover 3 PI, the C3PI, Cover 3 private investigators that can turn it up on the internet.
Between our listeners and ChatGPT, I don't have to do anything anymore.
All right. We will go from returning production to SP Plus. And again, the ceilings and floors is a really fun piece to look at. We'll dive into that with a focus on some of the teams that stand out from that exercise and more with ESPN's Bill Connelly. Next.
Meanwhile, on Paramount Mountain.
Okay, we have the northern face, the southern face, and
the Sylvester Stallone face.
Of course. Hey, how you doing? How you doing?
Is that Dad? Yeah.
No, don't sneeze.
Dear God, no.
Hold it.
hold it.
Don't do it. Joe. Ha! Gesundheit. Thank you. You're welcome.
Back here on the Cover 3 podcast, again with ESPN's Bill Connelly. A slew of excellent information available at ESPN right now. The returning production rankings, the SP Plus, and then from SP Plus, diving a little bit into the ceiling and the floor for all of the teams. You used Mark's way too early top 25, and then you threw in 5 more to be able to give us a nice landscape of sort of the top 30 or so. Let's start with just SP Plus in general. What were some of the once you hit the button, numbers are run, and you got some shifts from like the way things ended, and maybe even from your own expectations? Who were some either risers or fallers that really stood out and caught your eye once you got the new numbers in?
Well, the thing I was most scared of when I hit the button, the proverbial button here, was that Texas was going to be like 3rd or something
all season. It wasn't just you though. That's like
no. That's I felt like that. I felt justified because no computer was able to master the whole. They're clearly very good, and they're clearly going to completely fall apart in the 4th quarter of every close game. So like, I wasn't alone there. I felt okay about it, but I was a little worried they were going to be higher than I preferred. And so the fact that they ended up coming in 9th, that's fine. Once you move the bar a little too far, then suddenly 9th doesn't seem too bad. I was heading into this exercise. I was curious about Texas. I was curious about Florida State. Because they did finish strong. I know every single fan on talking about the Knowles internet has informed me that SP Plus has no clue about their offense. That's fine. It really the problem with Florida State last year was that they were 40th after their 3-game losing streak, 40th on offense, 38th overall, because they'd shown upside, but they were not consistent. They had a couple of very poor offensive games. So the fact that they then overachieved projections pretty drastically for about 4 weeks at that point in the season was only going to make so much of a difference, and seemed like SP Plus had a decent read on them by the end of the year again. So I'm pretty comfortable with them being around 11, but I was curious. I was worried they were still going to be like 19th or something. I was going to really get yelled at. I think the other most noteworthy thing here is that we got 6 Pac-12 teams in the top 21.
As the league is falling apart. And to be sure, the other 6 teams in that league do not grade out well at all. But, so this is kind of the average kind of tells an incomplete story, but you've got number 8, 10, 13, 16, and 21 in that conference. And then 5 in the top 21, and then Oregon State's 31st. That could be really, really fun. The average projected conference wins for those teams. Oregon's at 6.9, USC's at 6.9, Washington's at 6.5, UCLA's 6.3, and Utah's 6.2. So every single close game that one of those teams plays has a massive impact on what could be a really fun Pac-12 race.
Yeah, it tells me the Pac-12 champion is going to be 10-3.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, nobody's making the playoff from the
Mm-hmm.
Pac-12 this year unless USC suddenly can play a top 20 defense, which I feel like we kind of know isn't likely. But
Oregon and UCLA too. It's like Oregon, USC, and UCLA. Really, really good offense and very, very suspect defense, especially from a Power 5 standard. So
yeah, all five of those teams have projected offenses 12th or better, and only one of them has a defense better than 38th. Utah is 25th projected on defense. So
also, that Pac-12 group of 6 doesn't include Oregon State, right?
Well, 5. It was 5, and then Oregon State was
sorry.
31st. I looked at the list wrong. But yeah, Oregon State is 6th in overall, and they're 31st. They're only at 5.5 average conference wins.
And that defense is going to hold
debate.
Florida to 3 points. So
yeah, I have no idea what to expect of Oregon State because they were so not Oregon State last year. Suddenly they were really inconsistent, didn't have good quarterback play, and had a great defense even before the Florida game. So I don't know what that means, if they just kind of revert to form this year or what's going on.
Bill, I don't know if you've pulled this or not. I probably should have done some show prep here and asked you to. Is there any team that stands out to you in the first run of these? And I know you do another one after spring ball and you do another one before the season, obviously. And this is, I love that we have this because it gives us awesome content to start arguing about and starts to frame the offseason discussion. It's also, still early, but are there any teams that you can spot that are projecting way outside their normal range? Like this is probably the best version of X I've ever projected, or like the worst version of X I've ever projected?
Well, it's always hard with SP Plus because you do kind of, if you were better than you normally are last year, you're probably going to be projected to regress the next year. It's kind of, it kind of pulls you toward your history in certain ways, whether that's because I use recent history, whether that's because I use recruiting rankings. I mean, whatever it is, you're kind of projected and you're projected because that's usually how it works. But I did think it was really interesting looking at Schlabaugh's way too early. And like I gave him, whether he wanted it or not, I gave him my own input from that when he was making that list. But really, of the top teams in that list, the only ones that are anywhere that are not really close to where Schlabach had them, Florida State is lower. Florida, he had them 4th. But then, like Tennessee's a little higher. They're 6th, and he had them 10th. TCU, he had them 12th, and SP Plus has them 19th. But that's really, and Texas is higher because of course Texas is higher, but otherwise you have to look at like Oregon State or Tulane or teams like that to, that he had ranked and that will probably have a good year and a good win total and therefore be ranked at the end of the year in AP. There just weren't any standouts. I thought that was really interesting. Florida State's as close as it comes, but even Florida State's projected to have a really good year because they don't play anybody better than them except maybe LSU. It's
also like with Schlabach, being that he's not a computer system, he's probably also taking into account path. Like if you put Florida State in the SEC or the Big Ten, I really doubt that Schlabach would have them 4th, right? Like part of the reason why we have this Florida State helium this offseason is because everybody coming back, but also because they're going to play 8 or 9 games in which they're double-digit favorites, most likely. So they only really have 3 or 4 ball games that are legitimately losable unless they really screw up. So I think that's part of it, whereas SP Plus is just rating the quality of the team, not the projected record of the team. Right. And if you look at, like, I didn't share average projected win totals in the SP Plus projections, partially because we still don't know the max schedule and a few teams don't have like 12th games yet. So it's kind of incomplete, but for the top teams, we know their schedules. And if I sort by like average projected wins, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State are still 1, 2, 3, just like they are with Schlabach. But then, Penn State, Oregon, Alabama, USC, Florida State, Clemson are kind of the next batch. He ranks those teams pretty high, except Clemson, who he had 15th. So yeah, in that way, I guess the standouts, so to speak, are really boring standouts. They're Texas, they're Oklahoma, who he had unranked and SP Plus still really likes. UCLA maybe is projected. SP Plus is more optimistic about them. But yeah, I think the standout here was that there really weren't any, and that's kind of interesting in and of itself.
Does the playoff committee use your information?
No. They proudly, defiantly, bold, like they are proud to say they do not use advanced stats in any way, shape, or form. They do get stuff from Sports Source Analytics, but it's not opponent adjusted. It is not any sort of system. They are very proud to say that they do not use all of the information available to them that would help them pick the best or most deserving teams.
No, because they only want to use information that they could help push the voters to a certain direction.
Yes, CFP and on. Put our hats on.
Just saying, it's what they do.
It is funny though, because like I don't know if you guys who in this group has done that whole mock selection thing
They won't let me, Bill. They don't want me. They don't want me anywhere near them.
I've seen the team sheets. I have not sat in the room, but I've seen the team sheets.
So they do get a dashboard basically, and if you stand like all the stats that they use, yards and points and blah blah blah, they do try to sort of adjust just based on the opponent averages you face. But basically, if you stand out in a good way, you have a green dot next to it, and you stand out in a bad way, you have a red dot. So basically, you pull up two teams, and you're just counting the green and red dots.
Right.
Is what it comes down to. And
it's almost like they could steer it in a certain direction.
Well, it's like the relative yards, right? Like it's
like if you gain 400 yards against a team that allows 300, then it shows up as like 133.333 or however whatever the formatting is there. So
you've been on it.
I got to do it my first year at.
How many questions did they let you ask before they moved on?
They always do the 2014 season. That's what they have pulled up. And I was all but standing on the table, like stomping in favor of Marshall that year. If you remember that whole deal. And it was not, they didn't choose this schedule. They had games dropped and all that stuff. But needless to say, Marshall did not have a lot of green dots because they ain't played nobody. But I answered, I was proud of myself. Like I am very good spirited when I talk about this stuff, but they used like yards per point. That's one of the stats on that screen. And that's a regression to the mean factor. That's if you're too high, you're going to come down. If you're too low, you're going to come up. And they were using it as a you're good or you're not kind of deal. And I said, this stat sucks. It should not be used in this way. So I was proud of it. You're in a room full of former athletes, and I'm just this nerd who everybody expects to go, well, actually about everything. And I stood up for at least a couple things.
I love that. Can we talk a little Illinois?
Okay.
Okay.
I'm always getting criticism for not talking enough Illinois on this show.
We got I think we got like a 1-star review for I don't know, the guy had some curious way to write the word Illinois to make fun of Tom. I do see though, I ran last year's SP Plus against the preseason SP Plus for this year, and they are, I think, one of the only 3 or 4 Power 5 teams that rounds down to a -10 in terms of year-over-year adjustment. Is that just returning production, or does SP Plus see some unsustainable stuff that they were doing last year? I don't know how much you've looked into the Illini.
Let's see. I admittedly have not, but I do have my my spreadsheets here.
Hater alert.
Absolutely, like completely. So if SP Plus was based solely on returning production, they would be projected 26th overall. If it was based solely on recruiting, they would be projected 67th, and if it was based solely on recent history as a whole, they'd be projected like 75th. So that kind of tells you the story. Their success last year. I mean, number one, their offense still stunk. Like that, I don't think it's controversial to say that they were a very one-sided team in that regard. But it is kind of looking at them as like, do it again, and then we'll trust you. Their offense is projected to improve from 99th to 82nd, but their defense is projected to regress from 2nd to 13th. So that really might just be okay, that's great that you did it once, but maybe that was a little too good, and you're probably not going to match that this year.
Oh, they will.
Okay.
I mentioned that there's the ceilings and the floor, another piece that you can find on ESPN.com. As Bill mentioned earlier, we're talking like the 10% on either side, reasonable here. So want to just sort of run through a couple that stood out to me. And this is where, again, I'm asking for us to be able to talk ball, but also what the numbers say. So TCU ceiling 10-2, floor 6-6. And the Big 12 can do that, right? Yeah. I mean, like with as many one-score games as even TCU was in last year and coming up on the right side of them. So just from your Bill CI, like where do you think they fall in that window?
Lower. I mean, we saw last year, like we know how this works with the Big 12. Baylor and Oklahoma State win most of their close games, make the conference title game. One of them almost makes the playoff, and then they both, whatever Oklahoma State ended up last year, they both ended up extremely mediocre records last year. So we know what can happen if you don't have the right pieces. Bud and I have talked about like a close game formula for a long time. Like you got to have coaching as part of close games, but if you don't have the right quarterback play, the right timely execution, the right special teams, all that other stuff, you can go from one end of the spectrum to the other very quickly. So, TCU and K-State both. K-State, there's 10-2 and 6-6. That's their ceiling and floor too. If the close games go the other way, if you're going to be playing in a lot of them, the only teams that might not be playing in a lot of close games are Texas and Oklahoma, but can't really count on that. Can't really, they got to kind of prove that they're actually what SP Plus and other metrics think they could be. Otherwise, it's just going to be who wins the close games, and that's usually not the same team twice in a row. So I do think TCU, even if they're still a top 20-ish level team, they could easily finish 7-5 or something in that neighborhood. I don't think that would be a surprise at all.
When we were discussing like what you consider floor and ceiling earlier, you said 10%, and that like Nebraska going 12-0 was 0.02%. Would you say TCU reaching the playoff last year was 0.02%?
I'd say, well, definitely 2 or 3% at the least. I mean, they definitely overachieved projections, obviously, but they were still on paper probably more like a 10-2-ish team, not necessarily 12, whatever they ended up 13-2. Like they were still fortunate, but also they were better than projected. There's no question about that. So they were definitely up there, but probably not a 0.02 situation. They were they were supposed to bounce back a decent amount. It's just they bounced back far more than that.
So Nebraska fans, you can go 12-0.
That's right.
Don't give up hope.
What is 0.02%? Like one, let's see.
TCU was sitting on 28-1 to win the Big 12 last year.
Yeah. 0.02% is about 1 in 5,000. So there you go, Nebraska. Telling you there's a chance.
Yeah.
This also just for future framing of conversations is a really important thing to remember, right? You can be a team that is a legitimate like top 15 quality team and have a record that is somewhere between 6-6 and 10-2, 11-1, and that's why it's so important to actually look at other metrics, like an SP Plus, as opposed to just the win-loss record, because win-loss record is not as predictive as other things that you look at. And that's, I can't believe they went this. I'm like, is there really that big of a difference between 7-5 and 9-3? Not really in terms of quality of play. And that, I think this is something athletic directors should look at too, by the way. Like sometimes they make just some decisions that are a little baffling because of the win-loss record. I understand that win-loss record does drive booster donations or lack thereof and fan apathy and whatnot, but I
think I don't know if athletic directors are how smart they're getting in that regard, but I do think in other sports we are kind of seeing that. I mean, I realize bringing up a soccer example will thrill certain people in this room more than others, but that's the old go-to example with Jurgen Klopp at Liverpool, right? His last season, everything fell apart for him at Borussia Dortmund. They were in the relegation zone for a while. Nothing was really working for them. And his reputation supposedly took a hit. I thought he was still pretty awesome. But those XG figures, the advanced stats that soccer had at that point, certainly suggested that they were about the most unlucky team in Europe and that he was still really good. So he quits at the end of the year. Liverpool is looking for a replacement for Brendan Rodgers. And they're like, this guy's still one of the 3 or 4 best managers in Europe. And I think advanced stats get too much credit for that example because he was still, I thought it was pretty clear he was awesome, but you do see that sometimes in that, like, that extra layer of context can, maybe prevent you from eliminating some names from your list that you shouldn't.
Who you got winning the Premier League?
I mean, City, like
after yesterday, yeah.
Especially after it would have probably been City regardless of yesterday, but it's definitely City now.
Especially after Aston Villa beats Arsenal Saturday morning.
Ooh.
Now's the time to catch them.
All right, I've got a couple other teams, and I know that we might have some requests from the chat as well before we get out of here. Tom, Bud, y'all got any teams that catch your eye that you want to bring attention to?
Colorado. I want to talk about Colorado because YouTube seems to be juicing the algorithm in Deion's favor. Every time we talk Colorado, Deion Sanders, Colorado, Deion Sanders, Colorado, Deion Sanders, the numbers for the podcast seem to go up a lot. But legitimately, 40-plus transfers taken this year, and they're not done.
Yeah.
Did your computer start to smoke when you put this in? What are your thoughts on Colorado this season? Because this is kind of unlike anything we've ever seen, really.
Yeah, I mean, last year I said heading into the year that USC and LSU were unprojectable, and I think Colorado is absolutely in that boat this year. Because I mean, okay, so of the transfers they're taking in, absolutely, obviously the transfer portal has upgraded their talent level, but who's a proven star at the FBS level? And that part's important. Like, I mean, I know that Travis Hunter is awesome. Like, there's no question about that. But who has proven that they are with FBS stats, because I don't use FCS stats for returning production. I did that for a while and it just made things worse. I'm sure I could, put in a little bit and it would make it better. But right now I don't do any. Like Taji Alston, the defensive end's pretty solid. I guess Dominic, the other defensive end from Arkansas, is solid. He had 9 tackles for loss last year. Taylor Upshaw's fine. But I mean, I think basically SP Plus was like, okay, clearly they're going to be better. I'm just like, whatever. Like, they were so bad last year that they're coming up they're projected to improve by 10 points, which is just about as much as anybody is projected to improve by. But improving by 10 points gets you to 94th because that's how horrible they were last year. That's how completely devoid of talent that they were last year. So like, they're probably going to be better than the 90s, but I'm not going to trust them to be better than like the 70s. Like, their cornerbacks are going to be awesome, but what else is going to be awesome?
But the way that the ratings are going right now, even some of Colorado is in the bottom of the Power 5, but the distance between the Power 5 and the Group of 5 right now in the ratings is stark.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you could be the 8th or 9th best team in the MAC and in the Pac-12, and the 8th or 9th best team in the Pac-12 is probably in the 60s, like middle of the road for FBS.
Yeah.
Altogether.
Yeah, that has been kind of interesting. A decade ago, we took TCU and Utah from the mid-major ranks, and now we're taking 3 of probably the 5 most high upside G5 teams, and we're making them power conference teams now. So we're 4 really, including BYU. But so it is kind of a weird spot for G5s at the moment, and I assume somebody will play at a top 20 level. Maybe it's Tulane again or somebody else. But looking at the candidates, there's no obvious team that's absolutely going to be really good this year. And part of it's because we just took 3 of them and removed G5 status.
I want to talk to you about Iowa because we focused a lot on the offense. Brian Ferentz, 25 points per game, 7 wins. You can do it, Brian. We all believe in you. But what I want to talk about is in SP Plus. Come on. SP Plus has them at 27th.
Mm-hmm.
Offensively, they're ranked 81st, and defensively, shock of shocks, they are ranked 1st. But when you look at the returning production, Iowa ranks 94th overall, offensively 72nd, defensively 102nd. So how does a team that's lost that much defensive production still rank 1st in defensive?
I think it's really hard for to figure out those extreme teams. I don't necessarily think I do a good enough job of the extreme awesome on one side of the ball and just unforgivably terrible on the other. Yeah, we have some of those in both directions, and I never feel like I get a good enough read from a projection standpoint. Because I mean, that's like I said, the one thing you can count on with projections is everything. All the extremes are projected to kind of regress or progress toward the mean, and so. I always start the projections are best, I've learned, when you start with that overall number, which 13.5, 27th for Iowa, but then divvying out the credit after you do that, I never feel I get that totally right. So 81st and first. I guess part of the deal is you can't possibly project that offense to rank better than 81st.
Mm-hmm.
So the credit has to go somewhere. And when you give the credit to the defense ranks number 1 again. It is, I mean, the defense is projected to regress by like 6 points, but is still number 1 because everybody else is too.
So how much does go ahead, Chip?
Oh, you have another Iowa?
No.
Okay.
Iowa.
So the Georgia Bulldogs, 2-time national champions, ceiling 12-0, floor 9-3. Yet, the odds of finishing 11-1 or better. So the odds of finishing 11-1 or 12-0, 62%. Whoa.
Yeah. The 9-3 they barely, I was really hoping they'd be 10-2 floor. That would have saved a couple of fun tweets yesterday about, ESPN analyst shows how Georgia could go 9-3.
Yeah, you are fueling the next national championship run with this 9-3 floor.
That's right. And I tweeted out yesterday that technically they do have a 0.03 chance of going 6-6. So therefore, when you see that, so they thought we were going to go 6-6 this year. Now you know where that came from. No, they basically, there's a 12% chance of going 9-3 or worse. Therefore, it's 22% 12-0, which is double anybody else. It's 39% 11-1, 26% 10-2, but just a little bit like 9% and 2% basically from there. So yeah, it would have. I was really hoping SP Plus would do me a favor on that one and project them a hair higher. They really do, though. I mean, they're 62% win probability at Tennessee, which I think makes perfect sense. Everything else is 83% or higher.
Jeez.
It's just a perfect combination of great projections and Ball State replacing Oklahoma on the non-conference list, I guess.
Didn't you also not believe in the Kansas City Chiefs and say that 2022 was going to be a rebuilding year for them?
Yeah, why are all football teams all of a sudden doing the no one believes this?
Back in my Rocket Nation days, we had a run-in series, not to bring up Bob Stoops again, which is kind of weird. Now I'm doing it twice, but he was the best in the world at the disrespect fuel in the mid to late aughts. And so we had a series, the Disrespect Chronicles, because I remember in 08, after they scored whatever they scored on Missouri in the Big 12 championship game, like 65 or something, it was 6th or 7th straight game of 60 plus points. Sam Bradford in the interview was like, yeah, we saw they had newspaper clippings, all the Missouri players saying we were lucky to be blah, blah, blah. Like, no, they invented a newspaper article and put it on their board and everybody just believed it because the newspaper said it was true. Nobody on the Missouri team was saying they were lucky to be as good as they were or successful or whatever, but they believed it. So yeah, I guess it
was called like the Sooner Herald or something.
That's right. the Missouri Post. No, but I guess if you want to believe something and it's staring you in the face, then you're going to believe it because it helps. So pretty easy to provide that fuel, apparently.
I have some analytics of my own here. We have 3 minutes left. We need 13 likes to hit 100. And if so, the chat, Bill will give them 30 seconds on whatever team they want. That means we need to average slightly over 4 more likes per remaining minute of this show. And while you guys like the video, I will ask Bill, what projection so far scares you the most?
I mean, the easy answer would be Texas and Oklahoma, but I do think but there's logic to that. They really were better than they showed last year. Or they're better than their record showed last year. And Oklahoma still finished 10th with despite the fact that they only had one quarterback and that quarterback missed a couple games that were embarrassing. So that part I get. I'm looking through the list here. Like I said, I mean, from a conventional wisdom standpoint, everything looks pretty good at the top. We'll say, well, having Ole Miss in Florida in the top 20 doesn't make me feel awesome.
Yeah, Ole Miss's floor is 5-7. That was my favorite. Mm-hmm. Ceiling 10-2. Floor, no bowl.
Yeah, no, that's Oklahoma State's another one that was like 10-2 and 5-7. I figure between Ole Miss and Florida, one of those two teams is coming nowhere near like 10-2 or whatever, but maybe the other one does. Like there are still wins to be had there.
Is 57 the highest you've ever had Kansas to start a season?
Yeah, we got Kansas. We hit 100. Chat says they want to hear Kansas.
A lot of Kansas in the chat.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
Or one guy's typing this repeatedly.
And the most interesting part about Kansas being projected 57th is because of regression to the mean factors and all that, they're still projected to fall all the way to 30th offensively, and they're still 57th. So I mean, I haven't been. I'm sure I had some sort of old Rockham Nation back when you had the ampersand in there, SP plus. I'm sure in 08 I would have projected them pretty high, whatever I had going on there. But obviously they haven't been projected higher than like 90th in like a decade. So let's see where this goes.
All right, one last one. Do we have time for one more? Yep, Oregon.
I like Oregon. That's I think their offense was disappointing, or their defense, excuse me, was disappointing last year. And I think, both Oregon and Washington, I kind of have the exact same opinions. The transfer quarterback was way better than I expected it to be. The defense was worse than I expected to be, but they're bringing in transfers there. And if they're healthier, both of those teams have top 5 offensive ceilings and top 15 or 20 defensive ceilings. So problem is both of them do, and USC does too. And like you said, nobody's going to go 12-1 or 13-0, but that should be really, really fun, those games.
Bill, I'm sorry to inform you that the chat says that Oregon answer is incorrect, because yesterday they kept telling us that we need to talk about how Oregon had a receiver arrested. They got from the portal, and thus it's going to totally tank their season. So
which one was it, Holden or Johnson?
Holden. Holden's off the team now. Yeah, they booted him.
Bill
does not seem super concerned about that, chat. I
mean, from a projection standpoint, they're losing 25 catches. That's not gonna really change anything. But obviously, good recruit.
11-1 ceiling, 8-1 floor for the Oregon Ducks. That is Bill Connelly. All of the content that we've been discussing here, you can feast your eyes on it. You can take it into your brain over at ESPN.com. You can also follow him on Twitter at ESPN_Bill C. We will be back Wednesday. Well, happy President's Day to everybody, including us here at the Cover 3 podcast. And what are we going to be doing? That's right. Y'all loved the SEC schedule formation, so we're doing it for the Big Ten. Again, next Wednesday, we will be crafting the perfect Big Ten schedule for the expanded league. And you can follow him on Twitter at Tom Fernelli. You can follow him at Bud Elliott 3. You can follow him at ESPN_Bill C. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hamilton.